Welcome, everyone, to this talk by David Friedman. We're gonna start now. Is there a microphone? Well, there is, but actually, the speaker's not going to be using the microphone, so I wasn't sure if it was appropriate to engage in technological one-upmanship and use it if he's not. Anyway, tonight we'll be hearing from a man with many great claims to fame, including, perhaps the one closest to my heart, is being the author of Machinery of Freedom, sort of the definitive anarcho-capitalist manifesto. He is also a law professor at Santa Clara, and has a book in the works that is exciting on law codes very different from ours. And I always think it's good for the brain to be reminded that things could be drastically different. That's probably the sci-fi fan in me. And there's some sci-fi fan in our speaker, David Friedman, as well. So he can, he can look at ancient Babylon or Gypsy law code and law codes and things like that and ask, how is this different? How is it in some ways better? So read that when it comes out, or look at the draft that's currently online. And tonight, prepare to hear about global warming and other good things in our future. While you're listening, being passed around will be a sign-up sheet. As some of you know, I used to regularly host debates at Lolita bar. Technically, this event has nothing to do with those. But I am going to start hosting a new series of bar events called the Dionysium in Williamsburg, only one stop in, so it's not that hard to get to, near Bedford. So if you're interested in seeing more such events, and it'll be a mix of things. We'll do political debates, we'll have speeches, we'll have time to socialize, there might be comedians, there might be banjo players, or even synthesizer players, since I guess they're into those sorts of things in Williamsburg. Whatever keeps the hipsters happy, but I hope you'll show up as well. Not that some of you aren't hipsters. So sign up, and I will let you know, if you're not already receiving emails from me, what lies ahead. But in the immediate future, one of the good things is David Friedman, so I'll let him take it away.
The optimistic title is Todd's Work, Not Mine. In thinking about what I would like to talk about, it occurred to me that I could combine some of the subjects of my most recent nonfiction book, which is called Future Imperfect, and which deals with technological revolutions that might happen in the next few decades and their implications, with some thoughts I've had recently on the subject of global warming. When I talked about my book at Google a few years ago when it came out, I started out by saying that I thought global warming was a pretty wimpy catastrophe. 3 degrees centigrade, half of a meter of sea level rise in 100 years. I got 3 ways of killing off the human race faster than that.
Oh wait, one technological point. We've had some requests in the back for the microphone, if you're willing. And we can move it over. We can move it over near the chair.
The microphone is a device for the distortion of the human voice.
It's the ideas.
So, since then I've decided that I was overstating how bad global warming was, partly due to some discussions I've had on my blog and elsewhere. So I thought I would start by talking about global warming and then go on to some future technologies that I think should be of interest to everybody, but perhaps especially to libertarians. In my view, in the current global warming debate, both sides are focusing on the wrong questions. All right, one question is the Earth getting warmer? I think it probably is. One question is the reason human action? Very likely, but it doesn't matter very much. That if you think about it, one of the odd things about the debate is that both sides think it's really important whether it's human action or something else that makes the Earth get warmer. Why? If some natural feature is making the Earth get warmer and getting warmer is terrible, we should figure out how to stop it, right? Now, people might say, if we're doing it, then we know how to stop it. We just have to stop whatever we're doing that does it. And if so, that's a very fundamental mistake, because that's thinking of humanity as if it was a person, as if it could make decisions. Consider that people have been aware for several thousand years that we would all be better off if we stopped fighting each other. Hasn't happened. So the fact that something could be done if all human beings decided to do it doesn't actually mean it's doable. And in particular, having all human beings produce less carbon dioxide very likely is not doable for reasons we could go into, but I'm not going to bother. I suspect the real reason people argue about whether it's human-caused is a much more fundamental and less rational reason. And that's the feeling that if we're doing it, it's our fault. And if it's our fault, we have an obligation to stop it. And this, in my view, is one application of what I see as perhaps the most dangerous fundamentalist religion in America at the moment, which is nature worship. The assumption that natural somehow means good. And that could be the subject of another talk. It's not the one I'm giving now. It's going to be a blog post sometime soon. But my basic point is that I don't think that the question of whether it's anthropomorphic matters very much. I think it's quite likely that it is. The question that almost nobody discusses is it a bad thing? And if so, how bad? That it is more or less taken for granted that if global warming is happening, it shouldn't be. That global warming, in fact, is usually assumed as a catastrophically bad event, and therefore we should be willing to do all sorts of things to stop it. And as far as I can tell, there's no good reason to think it's a bad event at all. Could be. The future is very uncertain. And there are basically two ways you can look at a question like this. One of them is to say, what are the consequences? Add them up. What are the bad consequences? What are the good consequences? You know, in a place like New York or Chicago, the world getting warmer doesn't seem like an unambiguously bad idea, especially around January. So there are good consequences and there are negative consequences. And if you try to do that, I think the answers are very unclear. That I got involved in this. Let me say something a little bit about what economists think of as externality arguments. All right, a very common argument among economists is doing such and such imposes negative externalities. It makes other people worse off. Therefore, you should forbid it or tax it or something like that. Or alternatively, such and such provides positive externalities. Therefore, you should subsidize it or mandate it. The trouble is that most things have both positive and negative externalities. And if you want to ban something, you will find it easy to find negative externalities and you'll miss half the positive externalities. And you'll be very generous on the size of the negative externalities and very skeptical on the size of the positive ones. And sure enough, the sum is negative, so you should ban it. If you want to support it, you follow the opposite principle and you get the opposite result. That in many, many cases, and global warming is probably one of the clearest ones, the real effects are so hard to judge. We're talking about effects over the next 100 years or so, that there is no clear objective way of deciding whether the externality is net positive or negative. And I first encountered this issue in the context of population. My first published work on economics was a paper called Laissez-faire in Population, the Least Bad Solution. You can find it on my webpage if you're curious. It was done for the Population Council. And in it, I tried to add up the positive and negative externalities from having one more child. Because people were assuming that it was obvious that having more children was bad, that it made the world worse off. And I couldn't sign the sum. I couldn't estimate the numbers accurately enough to be at all confident whether having one more child made the world better or worse off. And ever since then, I've been suspicious of externality arguments. It happens that I came across quite recently, as a result of a comment on my blog, an estimate of one of the externalities. That, as you all know, one of the terrible things that's supposed to happen with global warming is sea level rises. And you get people talking about flooding Manhattan and such. And then you actually look at the IPCC reports. And they're not really sure of the scale of the effect, but roughly speaking, their projections are about 1 foot to 2 feet in 100 years. Much less than the difference between low tide and high tide. And I happened to come across a paper by some people who had tried to estimate the costs that would impose. And they did it right, because they assumed, of course, that if sea level is rising, people won't just ignore it. In lots of places, they'll build dikes to prevent flooding. So they estimated the summed cost of building the dikes and of any flooding that would occur in spite of dikes. And they gave the result in terms of the total cost for a decade late in the century, the decade from 2080 to 2089, for the entire world, measured in present value at the present. And their estimate was $10 billion. So that's $1 billion a year for the whole world, which is rounding error. If you think about, let us say, the size of the US budget, or GNP, or the world GNP, any of these numbers, you're talking about like 1/100% or 1,000% of the relevant numbers. That's assuming a half-meter sea level rise. If you assume a meter sea level rise, it goes up to about 10 billion a year, which is still very small, although substantially larger. So that was quite interesting. I was actually pointed to that by somebody who was arguing on the opposite side, who was talking about how bad it was. And he was just pointing out how many people would be affected, but hadn't, I think, looked at their actual calculation of what the scale was. So it looks, at least on that calculation, as though that particular negative externality, which is one of the major ones he'll point at, is in fact trivial. There are clearly going to be positive consequences. I generally, in thinking about this, I'm taking the IPCC estimates, and I take it as about 3 degrees centigrade and about half a meter of sea level rise. And it could be more or less, but that's sort of somewhere around the central standard of it. And on the one hand, if you think about the effects of temperature, look at a map of the globe. Human use of land is limited by cold, not by heat. All right, the equator is populated, the poles are not populated. So if global climate goes up, the result is that Canada becomes about 300 miles wider. That's my very rough estimate, assuming 3 degrees. So does Siberia, so does Norway, Sweden, basically the whole northern hemisphere across Eurasia and North America. The temperature contour, the point at a given temperature, moves by around 250, 300 miles north. That's a very large increase in the amount of usable land we have. Now, it's true that the equator probably gets somewhat less pleasant. I suspect that people at the equator would rather have it cooler than hotter. But even at the hottest parts of the equator, which are not the hottest in the world, people are still living and farming. So that's not currently an actual limit to what we can do. And I would guess, without any numbers at all, that if you think about places people live, it seems as though there are an awful lot more places where people would rather have it warmer than where they'd rather have it cooler. So on that argument, it suggests that it's quite likely that the externalities are in fact positive, that we are better off, not worse off with global warming. We can't be sure, but it seems plausible. Let me look at the argument from a different standpoint. Suppose we're just saying, is there any reason to expect negative effects? Suppose we haven't tried to add it up. We just say, is there some reason why making the climate of the Earth warmer should be a sort of best first guess a bad thing? Earth and its climate were not designed for us. All right, so unless you're a religious believer who thinks that God, for some reason, decided to optimize for this century, there's no a priori reason to think that changing it a little bit one direction or another would make it worse. Human beings live across a very wide range of climates and prosper and grow food across a wide range of climates, much larger range than a 3 degree centigrade change would give you. Human beings have survived climate swings larger than is being projected, and they have done it with no technology more advanced than fur and fire. If you think about the past glaciations, I hope you all realize we are living in an ice age, as geologists define it. This is an interglacial, a warm period in the middle of an ice age. When the glaciers go south, the present locations of London and Chicago are under half a mile of ice. Human beings have lived through that time after time. So it's hard to see, from that standpoint, a reason to believe that changes on this scale will be catastrophic. Now, there is one general argument, and the general argument is that at any given time, human activity is optimized against the current environment. So if you ask what crop is a farmer currently growing, it's a crop that does well in the climate he's now living in. If you ask where do houses have air conditioning, houses in places where the weather is hot. Where do they have heating? Places where it's cool. Where do people live on the coast? Sometimes very close to the sea, or even a 1.5 foot sea rise might flood their houses. That's an argument against change, but it's only a serious argument against rapid change. If you imagine that the changes projected for the next century are happening in a couple of years, you would have a good reason to think they were a bad thing, because all the farmers would have to shift their crops, various people would have to tear down their beach houses and build new beach houses 50 feet farther inland. You can think of a bunch of changes they'd have to make. But we're talking about a change of 3 degrees centigrade in 100 years. All right? In 100 years, every farmer will have changed crops 10 times over. That's my rough guess. Because the market will change, somebody will introduce a new strain of wheat, people will decide that some other crop is in fashion this decade. The world is not static. All right? In 100 years, most houses will have been replaced. I happen to live in a house in San Jose that's more than 100 years old, but there aren't very many of them. All right? So in 100 years, if you're talking about changes over 100 years, the argument against change exists, but it becomes very, very weak, because we're making lots of changes anyway. One more change just means that when the farmer changes crops, one of the things that will affect it is the fact that temperature is half a degree warmer than the last time he changed crops. That's not a big change. So again, I think part of the sort of gut level reactions, again, this sort of nature worship, which says whatever is without human intervention is good, and I think that's very hard to justify. So, as I say, my basic claim is that there is no good a priori reason to think that global warming will have seriously bad effects. If I had to guess, it's that it'll have net positive effects. I don't really know that. I haven't mentioned the fact that carbon dioxide is an input to photosynthesis, and therefore raising the amount of carbon dioxide will tend, everything else being equal, to make agriculture a bit more productive. I should also mention there's an interesting argument due to a fairly prominent physicist which suggests that global warming will tend to have a larger effect in cold climates than in warm climates, in which case the good effects up on the northern edge of habitation will be larger than the bad effects down around the equator. But I don't think I'm going to go into that now because it involves physics. But in any case, my real point on global warming is first that instead of people making all sorts of arguments, some of them pretty implausible, for why it isn't happening or why it isn't anthropomorphic, they should instead focus on the weak part of the argument for doing all sorts of things to stop global warming, which is the, as far as I can tell, unsupported claim that global warming would be a bad thing. Seriously bad thing is what the claim really requires. All right, before I go on to talk about a bunch of other things in the future that I'm concerned with, let me just stop for a moment to see if people had questions about that. Yes?
I think there's a number of things you're saying that don't really comport with the scientific literature. I could comment. First of all, you give the impression that the IPCC has predicted a 3-degree warming. That's not actually right.
Yeah, that's right. What I said was they
predicted a 3-degree climate sensitivity, which means that if you double CO2, you get a 3-degree warming. We are well on the path to go well beyond 3 degrees of warming if we follow the business as usual trajectories that are predicted in the scenarios in the IPCC. The warming could be considerably greater than that. That's one point I think you should not go saying that. Moreover, it's not a 3-degree warming around the planet. It's a 3-degree warming, as you sort of said. This is not controversial. It's a 3-degree warming on average, but especially the North Pole is substantially more warmed than the average, which has a tendency to melt Greenland. This is the effect that since the 2007 report, there's been a considerable reevaluation of the sea level rises estimates, and the values you're using are probably off by a factor of 2. Compared to what today's consensus would probably be.
I did give figures for both a half-meter and a 1-meter rise. The half-meter was, I think, roughly the mean of the 2000.
Well,
it's all right. He's offering arguments against me. That's fine.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate it. My question would be: you also said that there was not a lot of literature on the subject. That this hasn't been studied. That's not my experience. I know that there's a great deal of economic, in particular, literature about this, And there was a recent summary paper by a fellow named Richard Toll, I suppose you may have heard of. He's a climate economist in Ireland. And his summary of the whole literature is that initially there could be a potential increase in human prosperity based on the warming of the planet, but that by the end of the century we're on a trajectory down in terms of the costs outweighing any potential benefits. And moreover, that this doesn't stop at the year 2100. If we set a rise, the sea level rise by raising the temperature, it doesn't stop until Greenland is finished. Are you aware of that?
I have not read his piece, but let me for a moment respond.
Okay.
I do not take seriously calculations that go more than a century into the future. I don't even take them that far very seriously. This is related to the rest of what I'm going to be talking about, which is that I think the future is much more radically uncertain than people usually assume. If you try to imagine somebody in 1900 figuring out our present problems, let alone someone in 1800. I've seen an attempt to estimate costs 300 years out, and I think the people who wrote that were insane. Because we simply do not know enough about what...
Told did it estimate costs 300 years out, just to be clear. Nor am I arguing that it should.
All I'm saying is that it seems to me that making decisions now on the basis of very distant projections is very unlikely to be sensible. The only case I can see where it makes any sense at all is asteroid strikes. We can actually predict the trajectory of a near-Earth asteroid literally centuries into the future. And therefore, it might, under some circumstances, make sense to try to take actions to divert a near-Earth asteroid to prevent a collision 250 years from now. But almost anything else, it seems to me that the uncertainties become so enormous when you talk about that kind of future that even 100 years is pushing it. My book, Future Imperfect, with one exception, I limited myself to 30 years on the grounds that it seemed to me that beyond that, it became increasingly difficult to make any plausible extrapolation of what might happen.
So if you knew that you were going to melt Greenland, you would advocate doing nothing about it? Over the course of
that would presumably, over 1,000 years? I certainly would advocate nothing over 1,000 years, absolutely, sure. Sure. That is, look, over 1,000 years, for all you know or I know, in less than 1,000 years we'll drop off the interglacial. And that's a catastrophe which is a good deal larger than melting Greenland. We just don't know enough. If you look at the geological record, Earth's climate has in fact varied quite widely over even the last million years, let alone longer periods of time. So anyway, you made your points. They're legitimate points. But I wanted to go on and talk about other things. All right? Maybe we continue this afterwards. I think one is enough. I don't really want to get into... You have a real question?
Just a really quick question.
Yes.
What about the distributional effects? So if his catastrophic scenario is right, what about the distributional effects? Because we got to create all the CO2, blah, 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 blah. But it's really poor people who live in really shitty areas that are really close to the equator and really close to sea level. They get screwed. So.
Well, on the other hand, a good deal of the concern in international stuff at the moment is India and China.
Yeah.
And seriously restricting the use of fossil fuels means that about 2 billion people who are finally getting out of poverty have to stop. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but so that it's not. I mean, I would have said the distributional effects are going to be random. That there'll be benefits for the Canadians. There will be some costs in Bangladesh. On the other hand, again, at even a meter. $10 billion a year spread across the world, say $2 billion a year for Bangladesh. Even Bangladesh, that's not a very large sum, especially Bangladesh 80 years from now. But anyway, let me go on to talk about some other technologies. And I want to start with the one that really first got me interested in this whole issue of sort of future technology, and that's encryption and a related set of technologies in the opposite direction. How many people here know what public key encryption is? Yeah, more people than a random audience, but nothing like everybody. So let me explain very briefly. I want to send a message to you that he can't read. And the traditional way of doing it is that I have a scheme for scrambling and unscrambling the message, defined by a key, a piece of information. I get you the key, I scramble the message with the key, you unscramble the message with the key. The problem with that is that if I don't have a safe way of getting messages to you, I may also not have a safe way of getting the key to you. And if he has sneakily gotten the copy of the key on its way to you, now he can read our correspondence. The solution to this problem was a breakthrough, I suppose, a few decades back, which is a way of doing encryption in which you create a pair of keys. One of them will decrypt what the other encrypts. So I create a pair of keys. They're mathematically related, but there is no reasonably doable way of deducing one from the other. One of them I label my public key, and I tell everybody in the world what it is. The other is my private key, and I tell nobody in the world what it is. If you want to send me a message, you encrypt it with my public key, you send it to me, I decrypt it with my private key. If he also has my public key and intercepts the message, he can send me secret messages too. But he can't read your secret messages. That's the guts of public key encryption. And it turns out that that mathematical breakthrough makes possible a whole bunch of interesting things which may or may not happen. One of them is a world where anybody can send a secret message to anybody else with a pretty high confidence that not even the National Security Agency can read it, or the FBI. A second one is a world where you can combine reputation with anonymity. Because suppose I want to set up an online identity without telling anybody who I am. All right? What I do is to publish the public key of this online identity. I then get a reputation for that online identity. For example, my online identity is giving legal advice. I'm going to call it Legal Eagle Online. And I've got a website which doesn't tell you who it belongs to and where legal questions are answered. And after, for 6 months or so, I've given good answers to legal questions, and people watching the website can check with their lawyers that it's the right answer. I then sell answers to legal questions. And other people can't free ride on my reputation because only I have my private key. Therefore, only I can decrypt messages sent to me that are encrypted with my public key. And only I can encrypt messages with my private key. Remember, it works both ways. So to prove a message is from me, all I have to do is to encrypt it with my private key. You decrypt it with my public key. You now know that it was sent by somebody who has that private key. So the technology allows both secure communication and identity without revealing your real space identity. Other applications of the technology make it possible to make communications untraceable through what are called anonymous remailers. And they make possible fully anonymous eCash, in which I can make a payment to you by sending you a message. I do not have to know who you are, you do not have to know who I am, and the bank holding the money doesn't have to ever know who either of us is. And again, if people are curious, my book, Future Imperfect, for those of you too cheap to buy it off Amazon, is on the web, linked to my webpage, and you can read it there. And for a lot of what I'm talking about, because I've got a limited amount of time, if you want more details, look at Future Imperfect. So that gives the possibility, if you think about it, of a world more private than humans have ever had. And it's got attractive and unattractive characteristics. I've got in Future Imperfect my business plan for Murder Incorporated, where the basic idea is that as far as I can tell, the price of a hitman is less than the price of a new car. Most of us could afford a new car. And the reason that it's not practical for most of us to have somebody murdered even if we want to is we don't have the right contacts. With a world of strong privacy, that problem is soluble. Because Murder Incorporated can demonstrate that it really kills people, it can make public its public key, and it can then take orders. So that's one of the negative things. On the other hand, in this world, we have freedom of speech that depends only on the laws of mathematics and not on the opinion of the Supreme Court. Because you can't punish someone for speaking if you don't know who he is. Yes. We have the end of professional licensing for anything that can be done online, such as Legal Eagle Online, for example, because you can't enforce rules against selling services if you don't know who's selling the service or to whom. So the overall effect, if it happens, is that it becomes much harder for governments to enforce laws. Some of the laws they want to enforce are good ones, like the law against murder. Many are bad ones. So according to whether you think that making governments less able to enforce laws or not is on net a gain or a loss, will tell you whether you like this or not. But whether you like it or not, it is one possible future, and it's an interesting one. On the other hand, we've got another possible future, not necessarily an alternative, they could both happen, which goes in exactly the opposite direction. And that's what David Brin referred to as the transparent society. It is becoming increasingly common, especially in England, but to a considerable extent in the US, to have video cameras up on poles in public places watching things. All right? So you have a park and there's a video camera, and if somebody gets mugged and they happen to be in the wrong place, the mugging is on the tape, and they can maybe prove who did it. All right? This is likely to become increasingly common. By itself, it doesn't affect privacy very much, because after all, the video camera is only doing what a cop could do if he was standing there, except that it lets the cop be out of the rain in a nice warm place watching a screen rather than having to stand out there in the rain in the park. Add to this technology two more, one of which is face recognition, which we're getting better and better at. The ability to have software which shown the picture of a face can identify the person, plus databases, which we're already very good at. We now have a world where when you are being tried, accused of a crime, the prosecutor says, and now tell me, Mr. Jones, where were you at 3 p.m. on September 17th? Oops, I'm sorry, I forgot. There you are at 3 p.m. on September 17th. All right? That is a world where everything that happens in public places is recorded and findable. And after a while, as technological progress brings us video cameras with the size and aerodynamic characteristics of a mosquito, public place becomes a very broad category. All right? So we have the possibility, on the one hand, of a cyberspace with more privacy than we've ever known, and on the other hand, of a real space with less privacy than we've ever known. And David Brin, who is the person who most called my attention to this, I don't recommend him. I think he's not someone I think terribly highly of, but he wrote a very interesting book on this subject. His solution, which is better than nothing but isn't really adequate, is that the cameras are pointing in both directions. That is to say that yes, the cops can watch us, but there have to be cameras in police stations too, so we can watch them. And you could say that we're seeing the first edges of that as we get increasingly cases where police get into trouble because they do something undesirable when somebody's got a video camera pointed at them. And we know about some of those cases. So Brin had a real point. I thought it was an interesting book called The Transparent Society. On the other hand, they can arrest you and you can't arrest them. So I mean, mutual transparency is probably an improvement over one-way transparency, but I'm not sure it's an improvement over privacy. Furthermore, not only can they arrest you and you can't arrest them, in many of the possible futures, they're the ones setting up the cameras, and they can make sure that the ones in certain parts of the police station don't work very well. So it seems to me that you now have the interesting possibility of a future with a whole lot of privacy and a future with little privacy. And then the interesting question is, what if we get both? And the answer depends partly on how much of our life is lived in cyberspace. Those of you who play World of Warcraft will realize that it could be a very large part of your life. More generally, as virtual reality technology gets better and better and more widely used, one can imagine a future where all the interesting stuff is happening on cyberspace. You don't really care if people watch you in real space. You're not doing anything in real space. The interesting question then is, can you control the interface between real space and cyberspace? Because it does you no good at all to have the strongest possible encryption on your messages if there's a video mosquito watching you type them. So we then have various possible technologies. At the low end, just a hood over your keyboard, and at the high end, something like a mind-to-machine link, encrypted, of course, which could let you do it. But all I want to say now is we are too conservative in our guesses about the future, and I'm trying to persuade you of that by showing you how technologies we already have We know how to do public key encryption. We know how to use it. We don't yet have fully anonymous eCash, but we know how to do it. Probably what's holding it back is that if you have fully anonymous eCash, money laundering laws become unenforceable, and many governments don't like that idea and are therefore going to discourage banks under their control from issuing anonymous eCash. My guess is someone will eventually do it, because you only have to do it in one place to be available all over the world, given the nature of the internet. But I should say I've been predicting someone doing it for quite a long time, and it hasn't happened yet. So that's one where I may be predicting mistakenly. I don't know. In any case, as I say, the point I'm making is only what that particular set of possible futures looks like. Let me go to an entirely different one. And this is the subject that I like to think of as libertarian eugenics. All right? Eugenics is the idea of improving the human race by selective breeding. And it has a bad reputation, in part because people usually think of it as one person telling somebody else how to do their selective breeding. As someone saying, you may not have children because you're inferior. Maybe even you've got to marry her because the two of you together will make wonderful children. You've got to have 8 kids too because we need those wonderful children. So that's not a very good scheme. All right? Robert Heinlein, in one of his earliest and least good novels, Beyond This Horizon, even a least good novel by Heinlein is probably worth reading, but he's written a lot of better ones, has a wonderful scheme for what I think of as libertarian eugenics. Because what he is doing is describing a technology that lets each couple choose among the children they could have which ones they do have. So in effect, you select the sperm that doesn't carry the husband's genes for bad heart, the egg that does carry the wife's musical ability, make the same choice across a whole bunch of dimensions, combine them, implant them, produce the baby you want. That's libertarian eugenics. All right? I should say, Heinlein either himself or maybe he knew someone else very smart had a way of doing it. Not a way we can do yet, but a way that is theoretically possible. The problem with the project is that inspecting an egg will damage it. All right? You're talking about very, very fragile things. So, but remember that each sperm has only half of my genes. Each egg has only half of your genes. The process which leads to that sperm at some point throws off the mirror image, the other half. Finding the full count of my genes is really easy because it's in every cell in my body. So you take a cell from my body, you do a full genotyping, you now arrange for the process that leads to a sperm or an egg to happen in vitro rather than inside the body. And at the final stage, when the mirror image is thrown off, you destructively analyze the mirror image, subtract the genes in it from the full genotype, and you now know what's in the other half, which has never been touched. Right? Heinlein was a clever guy. It's a neat idea, and I don't see any reason why it's unworkable. There are a bunch of lower tech versions of this, which are practical at present, one of which goes back several thousand years. The one that goes back several thousand years, of course, is selective infanticide. All right? You produce the child, and if you don't like it, you expose it. That was what the Greeks did when they didn't like the children they produced. The modern version of that is selective abortion. And it takes at least 2 common forms. In a country like the US, what it means is a woman gets pregnant. She uses amniocentesis to find out if the child is carrying Down syndrome, or anything else you can detect that's serious, but that's the usual one people worry about. If it is, you abort it. In parts of the world where people would much rather have a son than a daughter, you apply the same technology to abort the female fetus if you want a son. Especially likely in China because of the one-child policy. All right? There's a fancier version which is now doable also, although not as easily doable. And that is, you produce the fertilized egg, you produce a bunch of fertilized eggs in vitro, in glass, outside the woman's body. You let each of them go to the 8-cell level of embryo. They call it a pre-embryo, but it's really just a very early stage embryo. At 8 cells, you can remove 1 cell without damaging the embryo. So you pull one of the 8 cells, you destructively analyze its genes, and you pick from the fertilized eggs you made the one that doesn't have whatever negative features you're trying to get rid of. That's current technology. That's now doable. Now being done, I gather. There's another current technology, which is actually the first step towards Heinlein's version, because it's one. Notice that you have an enormously more powerful tool if you can choose sperm and egg separately. All right? If you imagine that you can analyze 10 fertilized eggs, you can only get the best 10th of the children you could have, so to speak. If you can analyze 10 sperm and 10 eggs, you get the best 1% of children you can have, because you pick the best of each of those two to combine. The version of that that now exists is used for sex selection. As you probably know, the sex of the offspring is determined by the sperm, not the egg. Women only have X chromosomes, so the egg always has an X. The sperm can have an X or a Y, and XY is male, XX is female. The X chromosome is bigger than the Y chromosome. And it is now possible to separate imperfectly sperm carrying X chromosomes from sperm carrying Y chromosomes, and the people who do it claim something like an 80% success rate. So this is a way in which people who want to have a boy or want to have a girl can have a sizably better than random chance of doing it by selecting on just one of the 2 cells that go to make up that up. So that's sort of the earliest version, as it were, of Heinlein's vision. And it struck me as sort of interesting when I realized that was happening. Also, if you think about the progression I've described, not only does it move to less technologically sophisticated, it also moves to less morally problematical. That most of us are uncomfortable with selective infanticide, even though the Greeks apparently weren't. Many people are uncomfortable with selective abortion. Some people will be uncomfortable with selecting among 8-cell fetuses and throwing out the ones you don't want. I don't think I know anybody who is uncomfortable with the idea of selecting the particular sperm you want, given that you already know that practically all sperm go to waste anyway. Maybe, I'll take your word for it. Sperm is an excess supply. So there may be people who are unhappy with the consequence, who are unhappy with sex selection, because you then have the various issues of what happened if you have a population that's 60% male and 40% female, say. As you may know, there's a libertarian novelist, Neil Schulman, who wrote a novel about this, Rainbow Cadenza. Not a great novel, but certainly a readable novel. Neil is a nice guy. He's not a Heinlein. Very few of us are. I'm not either. I won't even claim that either of my novels is better than Neil's. Maybe he will. I don't know. Hope he will. Anyway, so as I was saying, so this gives a very interesting technology, which, as it progresses, could have quite striking effects on the human race in a period of a generation or two. That you could surely imagine pushing up IQ, if you think about the fact that IQ is very roughly 50% genetic, 50% environmental, depending, of course, on how much the genetics vary and how much the environment varies. And I assume all of you realize that when people talk about how much of intelligence is due to environment and how much to genetics, stated that way, there isn't an answer. Because if you imagine a population where everybody was clones, all variation would be due to environment, because the genetics would be all identical. If you imagine a world where everybody is raised exactly identically, all variation is genetic, because the environment is identical. Anywhere between that is going to determine it. But for real-world situations, I think the available evidence suggests somewhere vaguely around 50%. And that's enough so that if everybody has not a random child, but the smartest child they can produce, assuming that most people value smart kids, which I think most people do, then you could raise the population IQ in a generation or two. You could eliminate practically all genetic diseases in a generation or two in this kind of way. So you could make some quite noticeable changes in the world by these technologies. Even some of those changes are what we've now got. If you take my 8-cell version, if we get to the point where we can easily do a full genotyping cheap, which we're getting to very quickly, and if we get to the point where we actually know what genes do, which is going to be a much slower process, you could then at least pick the best 10th of children you want, using reproductive technology we already have, plus genetic information we don't yet have, but presumably will. So all of that is sort of interesting to me, at least. Let me go on to talk about another couple of technologies, namely biotechnology and nanotechnology. And I'll talk mostly about nanotech because they raise many of the same issues, and nanotech is sexier. You might think biotech would be sexier because it's partly about sex, but nanotech, for those not familiar with it, starts with the observation that essentially everything human beings make is made on an incredibly crude scale, using trillions of atoms for every part. Living creatures, on the other hand, are engineered at the molecular scale. That your DNA, every atom matters. Ditto for proteins, for lots of other things. As our technology improves, we become more and more able to do the same thing, to engineer things where your machine is essentially a single molecule where every atom counts. And a number of people, starting originally with Feynman, Richard Feynman originally pointed out the possibilities, and then Eric Drexler picked it up and wrote a book on it and started an organization to promote the idea. And it turns out that if you can do nanotech, you can have quite striking results. Because the real secret to successful nanotech is to build something called a general purpose assembler. A general purpose assembler is a molecular machine for making molecular machines. Think of it as a molecular machine which is a programmable factory. And what is the input to that factory? It is conveniently provided with an unlimited supply of identical parts called atoms. All it has to do is stick them together according to instructions. And suppose that you have created the world's first general purpose assembler. What is the first thing you tell it to make? A general purpose assembler. You've got it. And now you have 2 general purpose assemblers. And what do you tell them to make? And now you have 4 general purpose assemblers, and 8, and 16, and 32, and 64, and 100. 10 doubling, you've got 1,024. 20 doubling, you're past 1,000,000. So once you've got one, you've got as many as you want. And now, if you can only design things at the atomic scale, you can do some very impressive things. One of them, for example, is a cell repair machine. A cell repair machine is a very small robot submarine. It's small enough so that it can go inside a cell and fix whatever is wrong. And you make a whole lot of them, and you turn them loose, and they fix everything in your body that is wrong every year. And you live forever. Assuming the sun doesn't burn out or problems of that sort. For a macro version of the potential for nanotech, let us imagine that somebody designs a nanotech automobile. The windshield is probably diamond. Carbon is very cheap, and diamond is very unscratchable. The whole thing is structured at the atomic scale. You download the instructions, the program. You feed them to your army of general purpose assemblers. You dig a hole in the backyard. Dirt is largely aluminum. You dump in your assemblers, some gasoline to disassemble for power, and bits of this and that that your instructions say it's going to need. And in the morning, there is your car sitting there. And if you think that's impossible, consider how an oak tree gets built. All right, it's the same technology produced by evolution instead of humans. So that's sort of part of that possible future, and it's a pretty radically different future. Now, as an economist, when I first heard about this at a conference at MIT a very long time ago, it occurred to me to ask, what's the economy going to look like? Because this is a world where the cost is almost all design and not construction. That designing that nanotech car is going to be real hard, because there are an awful lot of atoms in it, even with lots of duplication. But once you've got the design, everybody's got a backyard they can dig a hole in. And it then occurred to me that we actually have a technology with exactly those features. It's called software. Software like nanotech The cost of writing the first copy of Microsoft Word is many, many millions of dollars worth of programming time. And the cost of making the second copy is 1 CD. All right, 1 blank CD that you use to put it on. So you would expect that nanotech would give you an economy somewhat like the software economy. And again, if you want my thoughts on how you pay for building that car with a number of different options, read the book. Now I've discussed the upside of this. As I say, it was Todd, not me, who gave us our optimistic title, because there are downsides too. And you're all familiar with the potential downside from the wonders of biotech, namely engineered plagues. The downside to nanotech has been referred to in the literature as the gray goo scenario. And the gray goo scenario consists of making a very small nanotech device, which is a replicator. It makes copies of itself. Its only purpose in life is to turn everything it encounters into copies of itself. And it takes it, I think, a week or two to eat the world, assuming good design and enough sunlight to power it. That's to turn the world into gray goo. I'm told that later calculations show the goo wouldn't be gray. I don't remember why. So you've got at least the potential problem, which is the nanotech equivalent of when you have a really developed biotech, some high school kid in his basement ends the human race. And this is the nanotech version of that. And one of my friends who's been involved with this, one of the early public key encryption people, I had come to my class to give guest lectures for a while. And his guest lecture always consisted in part of trying to provoke me into agreeing that you need government regulation to prevent catastrophes along these lines. And I think he wanted me to think about the question. He's a libertarian too, I should say. And I thought about the question, and I concluded that you probably don't want government regulation. And the reason, I think, is most easily seen by imagining two different stages. And this could be either nanotech or biotech, it doesn't matter. At stage one, it's really hard and expensive. At stage one, it's possible to make nanotech devices, but you need billions of dollars worth of experts and machinery and so forth. Or it's possible to design diseases, but you need a lot of very sophisticated stuff. High school kid in his basement's not going to do that. What is the only sort of organization that's likely to do that? And what is the only kind of organization that spends very large amounts of money figuring out how to kill people? All right? So in that world, it seems to me that saying you will make nanotech or biotech a government monopoly is handing over the keys to the henhouse to the fox. And it's particularly undesirable if you consider that while there is not much of a market outside of governments for killing people, there's a huge market for not killing people. The whole medical profession, essentially. So in a world where these things are expensive, you will have market provision by a few large companies of defenses, because defenses are valuable, of cures, so to speak, and you may have government provision of diseases. And it does not seem to me that in that world, turning over the control of the technology to government is really a clever idea. I like to say that there's only one time in my life when I was seriously worried about the possibility that I and my family would be wiped out by a disease. And that was when I started thinking about the smallpox problem. Because it was arguable, at least after 9/11, a number of people pointed out, that it might be possible to culture smallpox out of frozen corpses in the Arctic. Theoretically, smallpox was entirely eliminated, except for some stores held, I think, by both the Soviet Union and the US. And there wasn't anything like enough vaccine to vaccinate the world. And why wasn't there enough vaccine to vaccinate the world? Because vaccination was basically a government project, and since the problem was solved, why keep large stores of vaccine? And it seemed to me likely that if the whole vaccination business was a free market business, some clever person would have spent a few million a year on a very large freezer with enough doses of vaccine for at least the United States and maybe for the world. What? Sorry. So let me go on to the second stage. The second stage is when the high school kid becomes dangerous. This is when nanotech or biotech has gotten really easy. It's a really advanced technology, just like kids building computers in their basement, which if you can buy the parts, of course, you can do. Now we have to worry. But again, the high school kid who's crazy enough to do it is competing with a whole lot of companies that are trying to make defenses because people don't want to have their part of the world turned into gray goo and don't want to die of an engineered plague. So in that case, if it turns out that offense is much easier than defense, we're dead. But as long as offense isn't much easier than defense, there's going to be $1 million spent on defense for every dollar spent on offense, and with luck, that's going to keep us going. And we have a little bit of evidence on this question, because after all, living creatures are already nanotech. You and I are nanotech. That's the machinery that runs us. There is already a gray goo war going on, and it's been going on for as long as there have been macroorganisms, several hundred million years. In between bacteria, viruses, etc., that is very small living things designed at the atomic scale for the purpose of turning everything into them. That's what a bacterium is doing. And big nanotech machines, namely us and elephants and fish and ants, all of whom are big on a nanotech scale, which have defenses against that. Well, the bacteria are still around, but so are we. So that's some evidence that you don't have an overwhelming superiority for offense over defense. It's limited evidence because living creatures are only a small range of possible nanotech. They're only basically carbon-based nanotech, so maybe it won't be true, but at least it's grounds for mild optimism on that particular subject. All right, let me go on to another technology, and this is one that is of vital interest to everybody in this room, because everybody in this room is dying of an incurable disease. It's called aging. It's not clear that it will stay incurable. If you think about it, it is hard to come up with any good reason why the aging problem can't eventually be solved. After all, the construction of your body is basically a matter of information. The information is genetic, and there is a copy in every cell in your body. That is massive redundancy. And that means that however much random damage comes through mutation, all you need is to pull 20 cells, take a majority vote on every gene, and you're back where you started. All right? So that means that in principle, we ought to be able to solve aging. My guess is not in time for me. Could be wrong, but that's my guess. But with luck, in time for my kids. And then that gets you thinking about the interesting question of what a world would be like in which people no longer got old. Or if you want to carry it even further, in which people no longer got old and could choose their physical age, in which you could go back to being a 20-year-old if you wanted to. And I guess I will let you think about what to me is one of the interesting questions is what life would you live? If you didn't have a death sentence hanging over you, as everybody always has had, what would you choose to do with your life? Would you do the same profession forever? Would you live very frugally and save as much as you could and then at 70 retire forever? Would you take the compromise? By 70 you've got enough money to live at least sort of a tolerable level, and from then on you only take jobs that you think are fun. Those are all possibilities. Now, one of the issues that's raised when you talk about this is population. I think people greatly exaggerate the dangers of population growth, but then I've been thinking about it in terms of the kind of population growth we have had in the past. I figure doubling the Earth's population, I can't see any good reason to think it would have intolerable consequences. I could be wrong. Multiplying it 1,000-fold might be a little more serious. And then the interesting question turns out to be, whether people who don't grow old want to keep having babies or not. All right? If what happens is that you say, all right, I had kids, I raised kids, that was great fun, I'll enjoy my grandchildren, thank you. Then if you end aging, population rises, but only linearly, because people stop dying. If people say, well, it was really neat having babies, let's do it again, and again, and again, you then get an exponential growth, and that might be enough to even scare me. But in any case, it's one of many issues I think worth at least thinking about. If it isn't obvious, my outline for this talk is on my cell phone. That's what I'm doing at the moment. All right, let me go on to another set of possible technologies that I find intriguing, both for negative and positive possible consequences, and that's mind drugs. All right? We know a whole lot about more about how humans work than we did 100 years ago. That's why we may be able to solve aging. One part of that is we know more about neurochemicals. We know more how the brain works. We can imagine mind drugs being used, A, for entertainment as they're used now, B, to improve people, that lots of people in fact think that taking coffee will make them more alert. Some people think taking a little of alcohol will make them more relaxed. And you could imagine much more extreme versions of that in the future. But finally, and perhaps most disturbingly, to control people. That alcohol, if you think about it, does all three. People get drunk because they enjoy it. People take a drink because they think they can function better when they're more relaxed. And people get other people drunk in order to seduce them. So in fact, it is a pleasure drug, an enhancement drug, and a control drug. And then you can imagine a world where these things are much better. And you have to worry about the credulity drug, for example, which somebody tries to feed you before negotiating a contract or selling you a bridge in Manhattan or something like that. Half in Manhattan, all right? The other end is somewhere else. So that's interesting. And I like to imagine the combination of mind drugs and nanotech, where you've got this little thing implanted in your wrist, and it flashes red when certain things show up in your bloodstream. This is not impossible because it already exists. It's just what now exists is a very primitive version. There is, in fact, a test kit which is used, I think, for picking up Rohypnol, which is sometimes referred to as the date rape drug. And when your date offers you a drink, you unobtrusively drop a couple of drops onto the test strip, and if it turns the wrong color, you don't drink it. It's the most important thing in the world. And after you've been married for a while, the next time you're going to encounter it is when you have babies. Because the parental focus on small children is a lot like the adult focus on somebody you're in love with. That suddenly this little person is the most important thing in the world, however that can be. Loving, which is what you need to make a marriage work, is a much less intense long-term phenomenon. Both of these are surely related to neurochemicals, and there is some evidence of what the chemicals are. Now, it may occur to you that one of the oddities of modern society, one we've all gotten used to, is this bizarre idea that you marry somebody you're in love with. The connection between romantic attraction and marriage is not typical of most past societies, and it's not entirely obvious that it's a sensible arrangement. The traditional way, of course, was that your family found the mate who was the appropriate ally for your family, and in various other ways was considered suitable. And I'd like to imagine the future version of this with individual control rather than family control. And that is, you first do a careful objective search for the ideal person to be married to, without letting your emotional feelings get in the way. And you presumably have done some research. We can do statistical research on who gets along with whom and what personality types work and all the other relevant things, including which side of the country people want to live on, which can be important. And after you've selected the right person, and of course you've got to solve the double coincidence problem, it's got to be a person who also selected you. Now the two of you get married, and part of the ceremony is taking your in-love drugs. And you now have a really intense 6 months. But 6 6 months is as long as anybody can put up with being in love. So you now get the second prescription, and you take your love drugs, and you're now happily married for the rest of your life. It's not an impossible scenario, all right?
Really romantic.
That's the question. Is it romantic or not romantic? I don't know. All right. The final thing I want to discuss is a much more general issue, not a particular technology. And that's the question of whether scientific progress can make us worse off. Because a lot of concerns about the future assume it can. A lot of worries, whether global warming or designer plagues or other things of that sort, are based on the idea that knowing more can make us worse off. And one's first, I think, reaction when you think about the question is that that's wrong. Your first reaction is, wait a minute, knowing more means we can do more things. That means we can do more, we do the things we want to do, not the things we don't want to do. It's increasing our power over our own lives and our own future. Obviously a good thing. That's not the right answer. It might be a good thing. It often is a good thing, but it doesn't have to be. And the way I want to think about it is as an economist in terms of the central economic problem, which is the coordination problem. All right, the central problem that all societies face is that you have a large number of people with different objectives, different knowledge, and different abilities, and somehow they have to coordinate. That almost nothing we do can be done without the cooperation of millions of other people. All right, you don't usually think of it this way, but after all, giving this talk, I used this nice gadget. I didn't make it. Nobody alive can make this. All right, in order to make a cell phone, you require some people who know how to make glass, and some people who know how to make the tools for making glass, and some people who know how to make plastic, and some people who know how to make little tiny cameras, and the tools for making little tiny cameras, and the pieces that go into little tiny cameras. If you try to actually follow back, there's a famous essay you may have seen, I, Pencil, which does it for a pencil and points out that when you really trace it all the way back, a pencil takes millions of people to make. Because it's got wood, and that wood had to be harvested, which required chainsaws, and the chainsaws required steel, and gasoline, and copper, and oil, and each of those things required, and you trace it back, and it would be possible for a few people by themselves to survive in a friendly environment, but not at anything like what we're used to, the way we're living. All right. That's the problem. It turns out there's only one solution that works. There are different variants of that solution. The only solution that works on a large scale is the decentralized solution, of which private property and trade is the most familiar version. And there are different variants of that, different legal rules you can have. The obvious solution, which is central coordination, works for very small groups, but breaks down for large groups. Both because because as the group gets larger, more and more information has to funnel through that center, which gets harder and harder, and because the people at the center almost inevitably are going to take advantage of their position to achieve their objectives rather than the objectives of everybody else. All right? My second novel is a fantasy version in part of that problem. For anybody who's curious, it's called Salamander, and it's a Kindle up on Amazon, so it'll cost you $3. But I think if you're an Amazon Prime person, you get it for free. But in any case, the only solution is the decentralized solution. But in order for the decentralized solution to work, there has to be some way of splitting the world up, such that I'm in charge of my part, you're in charge of your part, and most of the interactions can be handled by voluntary trade. You can never do it perfectly. All right? Someone upstairs talks loudly, that makes this talk a little harder. So we always, in practice, are going to have some effects where what I do in my part of the world affects you a little bit, for good or evil. Externality effects. Some of those can be handled through the legal system, through things like tort law for suing people, or maybe through regulation, or maybe through other mechanisms. But you really need a way of dividing up the world where my controlling my part and your controlling your part works pretty well in order for the decentralized solution to work. It is possible for technological change to make that impossible. Because one of the things that happens as we become more able, because we know more, is that the range of the effects of what we do becomes larger. So let me end where I started with global warming. Because the interesting thing to me about global warming is not, the most interesting thing is not the question of whether it's a problem or not. I started out arguing it probably isn't. It is the question of whether if it's a problem it's soluble. And the answer is no, I think. That the problem is that global warming is a case where every time I breathe, the negative consequences of the carbon dioxide, if it has negative consequences, eventually affect the whole world. Every time you light a match, every time you run a car. So that means it's a case where there is no decentralized mechanism that'll give you the right answer if those costs are large, which is what the global warming worry suggests. And you say, well, that's all right, let the government take care of it. But of course, there are lots of different governments. And the same argument that says that I will look at the benefits to me and the costs to me, not at the benefits to me compared to the costs of the entire world, also say that China will look at the benefits to it and the costs to it, not at the benefits to it and the costs to the entire world. Ditto for everyone else. Now, you could say that world government would solve the problem. In my view, that's a cure that's worse than the disease. Because we have, again, it goes back to the fact that the centralized method breaks down on a large scale for a number of, I think, well-understood reasons, since as far as I can tell, there is no decentralized solution to the potential global warming problem, and there may be other such problems. Even if I'm right that global warming is not a catastrophic problem, that doesn't mean that no other technology will give you some. So I wanted to sort of end, because I'm talking mostly to libertarians, and libertarians tend to be optimists, and they tend to think that leaving people alone works. Leaving people alone might be the best solution, but it might kill all of us anyway. All right? There is no guarantee that the best solution works very well. I mentioned Heinlein earlier. Heinlein has a short story called Solution Unsatisfactory. And in a way, it is a very profound and very simple short story. What's famous about it is that it predicts the nuclear balance of terror before the atomic bomb was invented. What's interesting about it is that it is a series of events in which the protagonist, who is not the narrator, is seen as an intelligent and well-intentioned person who at every step takes the right action. And at the end, catastrophe is going to happen. Not instantly, but eventually. It's pretty clear. So what Heinlein is saying in that story, I believe, is there is no guarantee there is a solution. I taught a course at the University of Chicago one year, which I called Solution Unsatisfactory. And the idea of the course is that we have this gut-level feeling that if there are only two possible ways of dealing with a problem, once I've eliminated one of them, I'm finished. And so I was taking a list of problems for each of which, at least for the purposes of the course, I was willing to argue there were two ways of dealing with it, and neither of them worked. And it seemed to me that that was a lesson people ought to learn, that such situations could exist. All right, I think I don't know what time it is, but I think I've probably talked for long enough. So let me now let you ask questions.
You mentioned before about libertarian eugenics, and then you mentioned something about morality of reproduction being one of the things that would stay in the way. In my mind, I think class warfare, and I'm wondering if you would agree in that question, would be worse. I mean, if you look at school choice, you have proponents of public schools saying, well, the rich will benefit more than the poor, so we actually have to restrain them in these schools to make sure it doesn't get worse. Now you're going to tell these same people, well, we were trying to tell you that everybody's abilities are natural selection. So you can't fairly tell everybody, oh, we have to blind you so you see as good as best. People can say, now you're trying to manufacture an elite class. I think that is much more of a problem, and in the line of all libertarian history, of trying to overcome class warfare. What would you say to those people? And I suspect this kind of a rising tide.
Let me go back a step. There's a mouse geneticist by the name of Lee Silver, who has written quite an interesting book on human reproductive technology called, I think, Reinventing Eden. And he raises this issue. He puts it in terms of the gene rich and the gene poor. And I guess one answer is that human generations are pretty long and technological progress is pretty fast. So you're not going to have, I think, for very long, a period when only the rich can do it. that you would have for a little while a period when only the rich or the really dedicated are using the new technology, and they'll be improving things. A further point, which might not persuade people, but should persuade them, is that a lot of inequality at present comes from genetic differences, that if you already have the best genes, you can't improve them. Right? I mean, I've got the evidence of my kids. They're both perfect, so how could I do better? So on the other hand, if you had this technology, if the people at the bottom half are willing to concede that on average they are genetically inferior, which they may not be willing to, but if they would, then they could see it as, but our children won't be. Because we can have not children like us, but the best of our children, and they'll be just about as good as their children. So that would be one possible answer. Another answer is that, well, actually an answer not so much for these technologies as for genetic engineering, which is a more advanced technology when you actually are creating, it's really a nanotech approach to it, is that the cost is the design, not the reproduction, so once the design is done, it gets cheap. A further point in terms of existing biology is that, as I commented earlier, sperm is cheap. Sperm is in excess supply. So if you actually once have a identifiably genetically better people, women who are willing to have children that are not by the man who is helping to support those children have the option. That after all, the traditional mating pattern of humans and of pair-mated birds is monogamy tempered by adultery. That's true of birds, where we can do the genetic testing much more easily than of humans. There's disagreement about the frequency for humans with very wide range of estimates on misattributed paternity. But one thing that will happen over time, if there really are genetic advantages, is that people will choose to get pregnant by the men who they think have the good genes, and that will then result in those genes shifting down into more of the population. So those are all possible answers. But the final answer is that, like a number of these technologies, it's very hard to block in a multi-nation world. That as long as there are many different countries and no one country can control all of them, if one country does it, everybody does it. That's true of aging research, which some people will try to block for various reasons. It's true of artificial intelligence, which I haven't discussed, which is one of my ways of wiping out the human race within less than 100 years. Because if in 30 years we can make computers that are as smart as we are, in 40 years we are pets. And they might not want pets. But it's going to be very hard to stop it, because having a computer a little smarter than everybody else's is always an advantage. As it happens, my granddaughter, of whom I only have one, was produced in a rented womb in India. My grandson was born very prematurely, and I gather his mother had a family history of premature problems. And he is alive and well only because the technology of keeping premature babies alive is much better than it was 20 years ago. His parents decided not to take the chance again. So they produced a fertilized egg with her egg and his sperm, and it was implanted in a rented womb in India, and it produced a lovely little girl. Be harder to do in the US, and I suspect there are countries in the world where it would be illegal to do. But given that you have a very diverse world, it seems to me hard to block things like that, although you could certainly slow them. From this standpoint, I should say I am a fan of China. The two good things about China are, first, that it's big enough so the US can't push it around, and second, that it's different enough so it will want to ban different things. And as long as there are several countries with those characteristics, it's very hard to ban anything. Right? Yes?
So, in the nanotechnology scenario, you distinguish two cases. One case is it's very expensive, it corresponds to dollars and governments, the other one is cheap.
Yes.
And you simply said that the first case was that concern, and the first case you go on the government calling against, rather have companies. But seem to be assuming that given the nanotechnology, drug companies still produce drug, car companies still produce car.
Yeah.
But if you really have the nanotechnology,
Nanotechnology.
yeah, every hour you can produce more weapons, then you can double your stock of weaponry, on a very, very short time scale. So essentially, the first people who control nanotech, either a government or a corporation, and essentially has the option of taking over the world.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think, maybe a big government could. I don't think that any corporation with an unlimited supply of weapons and nothing else could take over the world, unless they were very superior weapons, which they might, of course, be. That's possible. But no, I think it's an interesting issue, but I'm not sure that it has a solution or it suggests any answer, because, of course, the U.S. government can't control what other governments do. The people most likely to be doing this research are governments, and that might be an argument for pushing nanotech research on the grounds that we want to get it first, otherwise someone else will do it to us. And I could imagine, I've seen the argument made that you'll have a dictatorship by whatever country first gets nanotech. That's a disturbing idea. I'm not sure it tells you what you should do to stop it, though. Yes?
Just follow on that question. Would you advocate there should be a free market in highly enriched uranium and plutonium?
That's an interesting question. Probably not.
Because right now we spend a lot of effort making sure that it's only governments that get that stuff.
But those, as far as I know, are materials only useful for offensive and not defensive weapons, whereas both biotech and nanotech are both offensive and defensive technologies.
Well, Iran is busy arguing that they want to build a power plant.
Yeah, but that's not a defensive weapon.
No, but a lot of other governments don't like the idea that they're doing this stuff.
Because those governments believe, what I suspect is probably right, that the Iranians, being sensible, want nuclear weapons. If you were the Iranians, you would want nuclear weapons, especially after seeing what happened to Libya. So it seems to me that, I'm not saying that I want them to have nuclear weapons, I'm just saying that it seems to me natural enough that they want to. So it seems to me that there are advantages if you can do it for making it hard for people to acquire enriched uranium or plutonium, because as far as I can tell, the major uses of those are only things I don't want to happen. Whether you can prevent it is another question, but at least that's been the attempt so far. Other questions? Yes?
For software, the context of the question, we started off talking about perhaps the most dangerous fundamentalism we see is this environmental fundamentalism.
Nature worship. Environmentalism is only one application. Consider that one of the standard terms against homosexuality was that it was unnatural. Why is that bad? Consider all of the things where people say this is a natural food. All right, sea salt is a natural food. Offhand, I can't think of any others. I guess venison is a natural food. Maize, what we call corn, is profoundly unnatural. It's the product of several thousand years of selective breeding. So is wheat. So are almost all apples. And yet, people still have this gut-level feeling that natural is good. So I really want, the claim I want to make is that at some level, the identification of natural with good is a religion, is internally pretty much incoherent, as religions also often are, and has sizable effects. Now, continue your question.
Yeah, and my question is, how do you think, do you have any speculation on how it became such a driving force where otherwise intelligent people is given, of course we have to drive these little conflicts.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. Part of the answer is that I suspect it's connected with the decline of other religions. I think there really are human tendencies to want to find something sort of greater than yourself that you can serve, as it were. And so part of it, I think, is that in a world where serious religious belief has become less and less common, a variety of substitutes. Communism was a substitute, socialism was a substitute, maybe libertarianism is, but environmentalism clearly can be. But I also have to say that if I engage in introspection, I can find elements of that religious belief in myself. That my standard example is I like to plant fruit trees. And I have a big yard by the standards of Northern California, but still a limited amount of space. In my yard, there is a large live oak tree, which was there when I arrived. If a bolt of lightning struck that oak tree and destroyed it, I would be a happy man, because it shades my fruit trees. It's still there, and I could certainly hire somebody to take it out. And why is it still there? Because at some gut level it feels wrong to me to destroy a large living thing. All right? So in that sense, I can understand the environmentalism in that I've got some of those same moral intuitions, whether or not I can justify them. Other? Yes.
You talked about transparent society.
Yes.
I'd like to know what you think the chance of having a dystopia where it's an asymmetry of information, and basically authorities and governments have access to more information. For instance, the phone was put in jail for tax evasion, not other things. So, you know, I envision more likely that governments will enforce laws of who they're going after. They'll have access to all the information.
Yeah. That seems to me there are two different questions. One of them is how plausible it is to have a world where Brent's transparent society is one-directional. And I think the answer is it's not too plausible for the U.S. in the next few decades, given that there are all of those cell phones and video cameras and things out there. And therefore, at least some of the effect can be gotten by private citizens, short of fairly strong actions by the government. But it's not implausible in general. I mean, I could certainly imagine a society where there were video cameras everywhere and private ownership of video cameras wasn't permitted, or else they just wouldn't accept their evidence in court, and where the system combined with face recognition and databases was used to track everybody. And then the second question is, what would that world be like? And that's very hard for me to predict, because maybe you would say once they knew that everybody was breaking the law, nobody would care about breaking the law, and they would start repealing all of the bad laws. That's the optimistic view. The alternative would be some version of Ayn Rand's line that they don't make laws to have you obey them, they make laws so you'll break them because they only have power over criminals. And then if anybody they want is a criminal, that would be very convenient from their standpoint. But anyway, other people, other questions, comments? Yes?
It seems that you touched upon that a little bit. Is there any cure in your sci-fi world for maybe nanotechnology where we can flow information from one to the other without a centralized buffer? Where we can all be on the same level playing field to make bigger?
Yes, that is one among the many possible versions of the transparent society. There is what I think of as an open source version, in which you imagine that there are lots of video mosquitoes belonging to different people, and that there is one or more pool in which I will feed my information in if you feed your information in, and all of us have access to it. And then, as Bryn points out, there are some really attractive features of the transparent society. For example, my wife, who's in San Jose, could be listening to this talk. And I could see how my kids are doing. And if you have small kids and a babysitter, we have elements of that. We've got nanny cams. But you could have that, or when the person who's supposed to be meeting you for dinner doesn't show up, you could find out he's nowhere close. I wonder if he got confused about what day it was. Or, I see what's happening, there's a traffic jam there. So you could think of a lot of ways it would be very convenient to have Bryn's transparent society, and it would be much more attractive if there was no centralized agent that controlled it. Now, of course, there's another problem with the transparent society. I don't remember if Bryn discusses it or not, and that's how do you know that what's being shown is true? Because, after all, we all know by now that the fact that there is a videotape of something doesn't mean it really happened, right? Anybody who's seen Roger Rabbit, for example, knows that, or has played with Photoshop for photographs. So that means that we're going to have to, if you want to actually prove things, you're going to have a custody trail, as it were. You have to have some mechanism to show that this picture really was taken by this video mosquito at this time in this place, rather than being created out of software or some other way. So there are a lot of other questions. I think I discussed that a little bit. Yeah, I do discuss that a little bit in Future Imperfect too. So that's a further set of issues. Yes, somebody in back?
If
if the displeasure of work and say lots of other displeasures like physical pain and disease and things like that are removed through future technology, where do you think human pleasure might come?
That is, presumably you could get pleasure from looking at beautiful things, from having thought up a clever idea that other people admire, from status, which is something humans care about. Lots of possible sources of pleasure. What will happen, I don't know. That is, let me sort of make one final point, which maybe is implicit, and that is I think most discussions of the future are much too conservative. And that, I made this point earlier, the reason I really don't think it's worth planning for disasters a century or 2 centuries from now, with very rare exceptions, is that there are just too many things that could change such that that particular disaster, either your plan didn't work, or the disaster didn't happen, or the disaster wasn't stoppable. My university is really big on sustainability. And they had a week-long program on sustainability, and they emailed the professors saying, would you like to give a lecture on sustainability? And so I emailed back and said, do you mind if I give a lecture against sustainability? And my university, they're nice people. It's run by the Jesuits, and they said, no, we don't mind. We'll schedule it for you. And I did. Didn't have a very large audience, but people were friendly. And my basic point is that if sustainability really means something clear, what it means is doing things in such a way that you could do them in the same way forever. And that's a crazy objective, because we don't know what you'll be doing in 100 years, but it won't be whatever you're doing now. Right? 100 years ago, we didn't need to make sure that there was enough hay and oats to fuel the transport system of the year 2000. And similarly for our future. So that I think it makes sense to try to worry about issues a decade, 2 decades, maybe 3 decades into the future. But as you get past that, it becomes more and more sensible to say, wait, we'll know more in the future. Might be a disaster, absolutely. I don't think there are safe policies. But if you say, we can only stop this if we stop it, if we only say 100 years from now if we start now, my reply is, you have no way of knowing what we should do now to control what will happen 100 years from now, nor does anybody else. Others? Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
I'm willing to keep arguing.
Thank you very much, Professor
Freidman. Keep arguing. I just don't want to do it.
And audience. Oh, and if you want to continue this discussion, just do so upstairs to give the bar a chance to clean out down here, which they'd like to do. And if you'd like to hear future such discussions, sign up if you haven't already. I'll be walking around with the sign-up